Hi, my name's Daniel Kitts. I'm a producer with The Agenda with Steve Paikin, and all this week we're exploring the political situation in Sri Lanka ahead of a Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in that country. When we talk about Sri Lanka, we often talk about it in terms of the Sinhalese majority and the Tamil minority, but Sri Lanka is actually much more complicated than just those two groups. So joining me to discuss Sri Lanka's Muslim community, or rather Muslim communities, is Fathima Cader. She's a Sri Lankan Muslim who lives in Toronto. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Let's just start by getting a basic sense of the size of the Sri Lankan Muslim community. How big is it in relation to some of the other ethnicities and religions and languages in that country?
Sri Lanka's Muslims comprise about 10% of the population of Sri Lanka. And in terms of language, they are predominantly Tamil speaking, though many of them are also, depending on where they live, can be and often are trilingual. So in the context of Sri Lanka, that means are able to speak Tamil, Sinhalese, and English fluently. And they tend to live all over the country.
Right. Well, when I introduced the segment, I made a point of referring to Muslim communities in the plural because you pointed out to me in an earlier conversation we had over the phone that Muslim identity in Sri Lanka is rather diverse and fractured. Maybe you could explain that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't perhaps use the word fractured, but so as I've stated already, Sri Lankan Muslims tend to be predominantly Tamil. And that, in some ways, given that the language politics of Sri Lanka provided a trigger for much of the conflict, to be Tamil speaking then is to instantly flag a lot of commonalities with the broader Tamil community in Sri Lanka. And a concrete example of this then would be access to schooling. So in Sri Lanka you have English medium schools, Tamil medium schools, and Sinhalese medium schools. And the kinds of education that you will receive varies very much depending on which schools you go to, which will then impact your ability to access post-secondary education, jobs, and services. Having said that, though, identity formation is so much more complicated than simply a pegging of culture or politic onto language. So one of the things that I've noticed about Muslims in Sri Lanka is that one's sense of politics and one's sense of identity is often shaped by region. And so that is, if you're living, your experiences of Sri Lanka will be very much shaped by what you've been exposed to in terms of the conflict. And the way the conflict has proceeded and the way the media has proceeded in Sri Lanka is to create these almost hermetically sealed areas of war. And so if you're living in Colombo, which is the capital, or if you're living in Kandy, which is in the central province, it's quite possible and it's quite common to have no knowledge of the ways the conflict is unfolding in the north and the east, to have no knowledge of the thousands of people that are being killed. Whereas if you're Muslim or if you're Tamil or if you're living in the north and the east, then you're much more likely to be suffering the brunt of the war and of the violence and of the deaths and of the abductions. And that often shapes people's politics in very profound ways, resulting then in very different politics throughout the country.
Well, let's explore that a bit. How would you say the experience of war has sort of shaped Muslim attitudes in the north versus Muslims who may have experienced the war living in Colombo in the south?
So arguably Muslims who have lived in the north and the east have had possibly the most complicated relationship with the war. And part of that comes, I mean, having said that, I want to start by saying also that it would be simplistic to say that Muslims have been simply a third party to this war, that they've been caught in the middle of it, because the ways in which power and violence unfold and the politics of war are so much more complicated than that. But the fact remains that Muslims in the north and the east have had to experience and had to negotiate violence from both sides of the conflict. And so what this means in the context of the north, for instance, is that if you're living in the north and you're Tamil speaking, the abductions and the killings of Muslims by the government on suspicion of being supporters of the Tamil Tigers is quite common. And so there's a long history of that happening. And simultaneously with that, though, there's a long history of the Tigers being quite resistant or reluctant to engage with Muslim communities in the north. And so in 1990, all of the Muslims in the northern province, so that was counted at about 72,000, were evicted over the course of 2 hours. That was also the year where there were a number of massacres by the Tamil Tigers against Muslims living in the east, of which the Kathankudi Mosque massacre is a fairly well-known example. And so the result of this is that by force, a very delicate sort of politic is formed. So on the one hand, you have then this, at one point in time, the Sinhalese army, the Sri Lankan army arming some Muslims to retaliate against violence against the Tigers. So it was, in a sense, then a capitalizing of conflict within conflict. This was also, it was these kinds of tensions that also led to the creation of the Sri Lankan Muslim Congress, which is the first, though not the only, Muslim political party in Sri Lanka. So for me, it's like all of what's useful about thinking about this, what's instructive, is that this kind of survey reminds people, hopefully, that rather than reducing the conflict to a binary of Sinhalese versus Tamil, we can think about the structural injustices and the structural inequities that are leading to these kinds of tensions, and that we can remain sensitive to the ways that these imbalances are being forced into our discourses wherever we find them.
Right. I think it's probably important at this point to underline for our viewers something you said earlier, you pointed out earlier, which speaks to what you just said in terms of the sort of binary description of the conflict being being unfair, particularly to Muslims, because, as you pointed out, most Tamils are Hindu, but most Muslim Sri Lankans speak Tamil. So they have to sort of sometimes deal with being associated as different from Tamils, but also as being grouped as Tamils by certain people. Is that correct?
Right. So there's this really complicated interplay between language and religion and ethnicity in ways that I think confound, again, that binaristic notion of what is Tamil and what is Sinhalese. And I should have mentioned this earlier, like, one of the things that's been really, for me, revealing and instructive about the experiences of Muslims living in the East and the North is that the nuanced politics allows then for things like cases of Muslims joining the Tigers, out of that sense of shared politic, out of that sense of shared experience, because the language laws affected Muslims as well. If you're Tamil speaking, you can't enter certain schools, that's going to have an impact on you. And you can appreciate then why it is that there are so many dissident Tamil voices against the government. And this is in contrast, of course, then to Muslims who might live elsewhere in the country and who don't have that kind of experience because they're living in predominantly Sinhalese neighborhoods where they don't come up against those kinds of inequities as starkly. And yet this idea then of what is Tamil is an issue because Muslims living in the north, or Muslims who lived in the north, were living in areas of the country that are the battlegrounds for the construction of Tamil Elam. But they were evicted because they weren't considered Tamil enough. So that has definite repercussions for the ways in which identity politics are formed, and who gets to become a player in shaping those identity politics and sort of the structural politics that flow from that.
Right. And to bring folks' attention briefly on the Muslims in the South, obviously being away from the conflict zone really has often resulted in Muslims in the South having very different attitudes towards the war than Muslims that would live in the North. Maybe you could explain a little bit how Muslims in the South have often perceived the war given their vantage point.
Right. So one of the things that is worth remembering about Sri Lanka in the context of this war is that there has been an appalling level of state suppression of the media. And so what you could live in Colombo, you could live in Kandy, you could live in the South and have no idea of the level of violence that was being inflicted elsewhere. So in that context, then, it's not surprising that people would subscribe to the government's scorched earth policy, which rendered, all of the North a war zone in the last few months. And so in the same country where you have Muslims joining the Tigers, there are also Muslims joining the army. But I think what is really revealing about this moment is that to be Muslim in the South then is to be reminded of the precarity of your position. So to be Muslim in predominantly in neighborhoods where government propaganda is on high, is to be reminded that you are not Buddhist and that you are not Sinhalese, and therefore you are never so far away from being the next problem or being part of the problem. And so that, I think, also exacerbates anxieties around how Muslims are supposed to operate in this state where their position is always so tenuous. And I think what that reveals, and it's a complicated, as cliche as it is to say, and as simplistic, that war is a complicated, multifaceted beast. And so I stress this because there's an impulse to impute politics onto ethnicity, to suggest then that Muslims as a whole have this coherent project or this coherent political goal. But what an examination of what it means to be Muslim in Sri Lanka reveals is just how porous ethno-nationalism is. And I think that's really important in the context of this conflict.
Right. And you mentioned to me that there's been recent attacks on mosques in Sri Lanka, so that precariousness has been reinforced?
Yeah, so soon after the war ended, the Bodha Bhavasana, which is an extremist, a collective of extremist fundamentalist Buddhist monks, started attacking mosques, started attacking Muslim stores, butcheries, and homes. And their excuse for starting that up was like a concern around having halal food in the island, which is quite a facile way of getting into it. But it's, for me, like, that wasn't actually surprising. It was distressing, absolutely, but given the project of the Sinhalese government as a whole to create a Sinhalese state, it's not surprising they would go after other minorities. What's also been really interesting in the wake of the war, even in the South, is the resurgence of war on terror rhetoric. So war on terror rhetoric was really useful during the war to demonize Tamil people as a whole. So if you were Tamil, you were an enemy to the state, and you would be demonized as such. So now it has allegedly been vanquished, which is a line that the government is using. Now you have to go after all your other sort of threats, and Muslims are this threat. So what's interesting about that is war on terror rhetoric is so familiar for those of us living in the West. We've seen it post 9/11 deployed to create threats. So now you have in Sri Lanka this context where we're concerned about how Muslims are mobilizing, what their politics are, and who are also especially concerned about the kinds of politics that Muslims bring with them from the Middle East. And that's interesting because so much of Sri Lanka's GDP relies on migrant workers going from Sri Lanka to the Middle East. You may have heard in Saudi Arabia, where a number of these workers work now, there's a mass deportation and mass arrest happening, because these are countries where the abuse of migrant workers is quite common. So the Sri Lankan government, even while it is capitalizing off Islamophobic rhetoric against Muslims, is also capitalizing off their abuse in these countries that allegedly are inculcating all of these terrorist rhetoric. So I think that's really, really revealing going forward. And it's just a reminder of the ways in which the conflict in Sri Lanka really is an international conflict, that they have so many global ripples. So you can't talk about the war on terror without also thinking about the way that language has been used in Sri Lanka against Tamils, is being used against Muslims. You can't talk about Buddhist violence against Muslims in Sri Lanka without thinking about how that's happening now elsewhere in the world, with Rohingya Muslims, for instance. So I think it's just, as a country, it's a really useful way to think about broader international politics as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Now, if there was a representative of the Sri Lankan government here, they would probably say that something like that they're trying to build a Sri Lanka for everyone, just one that recognizes that the Buddhist Sinhalese majority is a majority. I'm wondering if, the government has made any efforts to condemn these attacks against the mosques, made any effort to mitigate them, disassociate themselves with these attacks. I'm just curious if there's been any evidence of that.
No, there's definitely been a lot of disassociation happening, and a number of ministers have gone on record saying that they don't support these attacks and they've had nothing to do with them. But the fact remains that the attacks are continuing, and that they're part of also the continuing militarization of the north and the east, where, as I've mentioned already, a number of Muslims live. So you can't really disconnect the two.
Mm-hmm. We talked about sort of a bit about the post-war experience of Tamils in the south just now. Now that the north is no longer in a state of active war, it seems that there's been some efforts to mend fences between the sort of major Tamil political groups and Muslims. I know that some Tamil groups have expressed regret at the expulsion of the Muslims in 1990. I'm wondering how the post-war reality has shaped Muslims in the north at all.
It's true. A number of apologies have been forthcoming. In fact, Prabhakaran apologized in 2002 for the expulsion, and I think that was a really useful moment, because as much as, like, leaving aside the apology itself or the content of the apology, what I find useful about that is that it's an acknowledgement that it happened. And what I have found is that oftentimes history like that gets overwritten, especially when you're far removed, like in the diaspora, from the actual conflict. And I've noticed that in, like, people of my generation in Toronto have no knowledge of this ever having happened. So those kinds of apologies are important in marking history. And people are starting to go back home, both Muslims and Tamil people who have had to flee the region because of the conflict and who are trying to reconstruct their lives. So I think what will remain to be seen is what kinds of structures are in place that will actually allow people to build their lives once they're back. Something exciting that happened, significant, is in September 2013, the North had its first parliamentary election in over 2.5 decades. And of the 38 seats, the Tamil National Alliance won 30, and the Sri Lankan Muslim Congress won 1. So going forward, I think it'll be really interesting to see what kinds of democratic processes emerge in the North.
Right. And just to note to some of our viewers, you mentioned Prabhakaran. For those that are watching that might not know, Prabhakaran was the head of the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, also known as the Tamil Tigers. I want to move on to talk a little bit about the situation here, because you're living in Toronto, and there's obviously a large Tamil community in Toronto. There's a large not as large Sinhalese community. What's it like for you to sort of negotiate the various Sri Lankan communities here as a Sri Lankan with Muslim faith?
I think Muslims in Sri Lanka, just in part because of just Canadian immigration policies, are a fairly nascent community here. They're quite new, and they're getting on their feet and they're figuring things out as they go. And because of the ways in which the rhetoric around this war has been bifurcated, they don't often get a lot of attention. And oftentimes, in fact, they're expected to fit and/or boxes. Are you Tamil? Are you Sinhalese? And grey answers to those questions don't always go over very well. And so one thing that I've seen happen is, even in watching like some of your previous podcasts, one thing that happens is when people do talk about Muslims, it's often in tokenizing or instrumentalist ways. And so people will refer to violence that has been inflicted on Muslims in order to prove the wrong-headedness of either the Tamil movement or of the Sinhalese government. And the consequence of that is really to invisibilize the Muslims themselves and the ways in which they've had to experience that violence and also negotiate it going forward. There's also been, like in Toronto, there's a lot of push for a dialogue and for people to sit down together and talk. And I think that these kinds of conversations, these dialogue across ethnic divisions, or whatever people want to call them, these kinds of conversations are very useful, and I'm glad to see them happening. And I'm hoping that dialogue and solidarity will also will mean for people fashioning a sort of solidarity that is committed in transparency and accountability, in exploring and investigating exactly the kinds of truths that are really difficult and heartbreaking for people to wrap their heads around. And ones that are committed to holding accountable all of the power brokers in these scenarios. So that's what I'm looking forward to, being based in Toronto. as Sri Lanka moves into the sort of post-war model.
And so that's your view of the best way to go forward in terms of dialogue and discussing what happened.
Well, I mean, it would be a dialogue that is really rooted in facts and rooted in doing the investigative work that I think is quite difficult to do. And that kind of those kinds of fact-seeking scenarios, situations, I think, are probably the best that the diaspora can contribute right now to this kind of situation.
Fair enough. Well, Fathima Cader, thank you so much for taking the time to educate me and our viewers about Sri Lanka's Muslims. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.